unlimited economic, once limited or scarce resources. Every country, every nation on earth must answer 5 fundamental questions. Good day, economic students. The purpose of this video lecture is to introduce students to the economic systems of market-based capitalism versus the command system of socialism. So every nation, every country on earth must address 4 fundamental questions and a 5th question that proceeds moving forward. Every country, given the fact that they are dealing with limited or scarce land, capital, and labor, must answer these 4 questions or address these 4 questions. The first one is what goods and services to produce with scarce or limited land, capital, and labor. The second question is how much of those goods and services to produce. The third is about methodology, how to produce those goods and services, what techniques or methodologies to employ to produce goods and services. And then the last one is for whom to produce. In other words, who receives the utility or benefit from the production. Now, that's our stagnant questions in the time being right now. But moving forward, every country must answer another question, and that is how to accommodate change or how to implement progress into the system. Limited or scarce resources. There are 4 economic resources, and we break these into 2 categories: the property resources and the human resources. Property resources, land and capital. Land, the gifts of nature, minerals, metals, wind, water, solar, lumber, oil, natural gas. The gifts of nature are the land resources. Any of those gifts of nature which can be used in the productive process. Capital, any manufactured aid or tool that's used in the productive process. That can be something as large as a giant earth mover made by a company like Ingersoll Rand or Caterpillar, or something as technical as software which is used to run a logistics system. Any manufactured aid or tool used in the productive process is capital. The human resources, labor, and a specific type of labor, the entrepreneur. Labor includes the mental and physical capabilities of human beings that's implemented or employed in the productive process. And the entrepreneur is the individual who puts it all together. We will review these resources in detail in a later slide, and we will also discuss the specific income associated with each of these resources. The fact that land receives rent, capital receives interest, labor receives wages, and entrepreneur, if successful, gets profits. But most importantly, for our lecture here, I'm sure most people have heard of the 2 economic systems: market-based capitalism and the command system socialism. What most people don't think about is what is the economic divide or the philosophical difference between these 2 systems. And it boils down to one question: who controls the means of production? What component of society owns and therefore controls the economic resources used to produce goods and services? That is the major difference between the market system and the command system, and these 2 systems answer the question differently. The market system or capitalism advocates private ownership of economic resources. So in the market-based system, we have private ownership of economic resources. Households/individuals ultimately own the land, capital, and labor used in the productive process. So this theory of market-based capitalism was developed by Adam Smith, and it was outlined in his book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. The most pure form of capitalism is called laissez-faire, literally meaning hands-off, where you have a limited but active government and private citizens control the means of production and answer the 4 questions that we just addressed earlier of what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce it, and for whom the benefits yield from the economic production. Sometime later in 1867, Karl Marx writes a criticism of capitalism called Das Kapital, in which he outlines the ills or the shortcomings of capitalism, and he predicts that the working class, aka the proletariat, will rise up and take control of the means of production, and from that point on you will have a central planning entity which controls the economic resources and answers the four questions of what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce it, and for whom the benefits will yield from the economic production. 1776, Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith writes against the ills of or the inefficiency of the feudal system, which he thought was woefully inefficient, and he writes this book, The Wealth of Nations, in which he advocates for private ownership of land, capital, and labor, the economic resources. And he outlines what he calls the market mechanism to determine what goods society should produce, how many of those goods and services should be produced. The market answers how these goods and services produce, and ultimately who receives the utility or benefits from the production. So in the book, Adam Smith talks about what's called the invisible hand, the idea that there's no need for any government to intervene or to decide how land, capital, and labor should be allocated, that markets do an amazingly efficient job, and that competition drives businesses to use resources most efficiently, to seek out the least cost method of production, and ultimately society wins. He also discussed an idea called consumer sovereignty, in which the individuals and households ultimately determine how land, capital, and labor are allocated, based on the idea that when goods and services provide utility, happiness, satisfaction, individuals and households will demand more of them, thus signaling to the market to allocate more resources towards their production. And when goods and services fall out of favor or use, therefore land, capital, and labor will no longer be used for that type of production. He also discussed what he called the rationing function of prices. In other words, the market mechanism of determining what price a good or service should cost in the marketplace based on simple economics of buyers and sellers interacting to maximize their own rational behavior and efficiency. We call these supply and demand. We will discover and investigate the market forces of supply and demand in a later chapter. Important economic concept. The idea of Adam Smith's version capitalism was laissez-faire, limited government, and the only services the government should provide are a police and military to maintain order in society, and then two important concepts or institutions. One is the government securing the right to private property so that individuals don't have to waste time, effort, and energy protecting their property, and therefore they have incentive to better the property, and there's no lost energy and efforts in what is rightfully theirs to begin with. And the second institution is a legal system to enforce contracts. So limited but active government is one of the principles of pure laissez-faire market-based capitalism. What are the alleged benefits of capitalism? First is the most efficient use of society's limited or scarce resources. The second is this idea of the market determining what goods and services should be produced, and therefore competition driving innovation, that producers are constantly forced to seek out the least cost method of production, aka productive efficiency, and they're by default are constantly innovating their methodologies of production, which leads to more efficient use of land, capital, and labor, thus maximizing the productive capabilities of a nation. The other important idea is that capitalism proposes individuals and businesses will react to incentives. In other words, if you pay me more, I'll work harder. If I have the potential to make more money by inventing a new process or offering a new good or service, I will exert my economic efforts in that direction. If all members of society follow these behaviors, it leads to maximum efficiency. Now, of course, capitalism is not without its problems, but these are the alleged benefits of capitalism. Unfortunately, capitalism led to a rather inequitable distribution of economic outputs. Along comes Karl Marx, Das Kapital, 1867, outlining his rebuttal or his alternative to capitalism, in which the government owns the economic resources. And the idea is that you'll have a central planning unit and it will plot out all of the economic activity for society, including how many of a good or service and what type of good or service should be produced and what price should be charged for those goods and services. All right, the idea here is fairness. That's one of the alleged benefits of socialism or central planning, is that everyone will pitch in, everyone will receive some type of wage or salary, and society will have equitable distribution of output and income, and therefore we will solve this issue of those that have and the have-nots. That's the alleged benefit of socialism. Unfortunately, in practice, it fails to live up to the utopian vision, mostly because it doesn't achieve the efficiency, innovation, and it fails to incentivize individuals outlined in the previous slide. Economic theory versus economic reality. In the previous slides, we outlined the theoretical systems of pure laissez-faire market-based capitalism and the absolute command system of socialism. On this slide, we have a reality check on where countries/nations actually operate in the real world. If you look on the far right, the idea of 1776, wealth of nations, invisible hand, rationing function of prices, pure laissez-faire capitalism where the government provides only the military to secure safety for the citizens of a nation, police to make certain everyone's obeying laws, makes the government also ensures private property rights, and the institution of the legal system, which enforces contracts. That's pure laissez-faire market-based capitalism on the right, Adam Smith. On the left, we have the pure planned economy, where central planning unit, aka the government, controls all land, capital, and labor and determines all production. Every single solitary good and service from steel all the way down to candy, what goods and services are produced. In reality, neither one of these two systems ever existed. There's always been some government intervention in market system, and there's always been some market-based economic institution intervention in a pure planned economy. If we look on this chart and say, okay, look on the right, the United States and Japan represent what we call now a market-based welfare state, in which government plays a much larger role in answering the questions of what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce goods and services, and who receives the economic benefit of that production. Especially the last question of who receives the benefit of production through the mechanism of taxation and redistribution of wealth. The government of the United States and Japan, there's far more income redistribution through taxation and transfer payments such as welfare system, Social Security, subsidized housing. All of these level the playing field economically. So you can see that the United States and Japan are pretty far right, pretty close to the idea of market-based capitalism, but with significant government intervention in the system. Likewise, even North Korea, which we think of as communist or socialist, has some market-based principles / concepts involved in their economy. All right, if you look and say, okay, France and Sweden, we can put most of Europe there. To the left of the United States and Japan are the European countries, which are theoretically market-based capitalist systems, but with much more government intervention and involvement than the United States. And of course, there's pros and cons to this type of government intervention. Strictly speaking, Europe has achieved slower economic growth since the 1980s than the United States, and the trade-off is a larger social welfare net to assist individuals when they are out of work and or need job training, such ideas. The interesting one here is China. If you go back 1978 and prior, China was absolute positive command system, central planning under Mao. After the disastrous economic results of the command system and the starvation of Mao's disastrous economic planning, China decided to reemerge from isolationism in 1978 and embrace some market-based reforms. And you can see that China is almost towards the center of this system. So you would call China now a mixed economy with many market-based institutional reforms and significant amount of government intervention and control. So the point of this last video, or this last slide, is simple. In reality, neither pure laissez-faire market capitalism nor the planned economy of communism ever truly existed, and in reality today, it's a question about marginal thinking. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. At the margin, do you want less or more government involvement in your economy?